So I am Madison Harris, and I'm going to show you my research of making the solar cell that I did with Dr. Robert Freaknell. So first I'd like to mention that commercial solar cells are often silicon-based, which is great because silicon is the #2 most abundant element in Earth's crust, with about 23% of Earth's crust being silicon. So we have lots of silicon. And the efficiencies of these solar cells are about 18 to 22%, meaning that about 20% of the energy that the sun sends to the solar cell, that the solar cell finds, is absorbed, and we can actually use it for later. Current modules are about 25-year lifespans, but that's actually advanced a lot. A decade ago, they were only 10-year lifespans. So we have made great improvements to the overall solar cell lifespan. And pictured are some silicon wafers that we actually used in my research. They are N-type silicon wafers, which I actually have one here. If there were more people face-to-face, I'd be able to pass it around. Back in the old days, we used to do that. The efficiency, what does this mean? Well, there's a lot of different things that go into how efficient a solar cell is, and one of them is what the wavelengths of light are absorbed. So different materials absorb different wavelengths of light. Some are better at the shorter wavelengths, the blues and purples, and some are better at the longer red wavelengths. So we're trying to find chemicals that will absorb a very broad range of these wavelengths. Another is the operating temperature. If your solar cell gets incredibly hot, it may not operate at the maximum efficiency, so you'll then have to find a way to cool it down. That's not something we really touched on in my research personally, but it is something that goes into how they figure out the efficiencies of more commercial solar cells. Also, another thing to take into account, not exactly how efficient it is, but how much does it cost to make the cell? So if it's a very efficient cell, but it's incredibly expensive to make, it's not going to be a very good product for the consumer. And lastly, how easy is this cell to install? There are some solar cells that actually use 2 cells, and they pass the light through into a filter, and the filter will let the long wavelengths go to one cell and reflect back the shorter wavelengths, so you get double the efficiency, but that's very complicated and has to be set up very precisely. So we're looking for something that is easy to make, easy to install, and cost efficient. Our research objectives were to make a SIGS cell. SIGS stands for copper indium gallium diselenide, and we were using a silicon wafer. Now in this picture, this was the initial diagram that we drew for how to make this cell. We have an N-type silicon wafer that has a band gap of 1.1 electron volts. And you can see this sort of triangular shape along the top of it where it's connecting. This is from the first step that we took, is texturing the silicon. We wanted it to go from sort of a flat surface to more of a pyramidal surface so that we can increase the efficiency. Then on top of it, we would grow our copper indium gallium diselenide film. We actually, instead of growing all of that together, we applied the gallium directly to the silicon and then grew the film on top of the gallium. And then during the annealing step, the gallium would hopefully diffuse into the rest of the cell, the rest of the film, and create our full SIGS cell. The reason we were looking at these particular elements is because, here are a couple graphs. On the left one, you can see the absorption coefficient. You want to have a high absorption coefficient. It means that you're absorbing more light. And down here we have the photon energy. So the different wavelengths of light that I was talking about earlier. Copper indium diselenide here is a clear winner for how broad it can reach for the amount of wavelengths that it can absorb. And it's also a regular winner for the absorption coefficient. So that's why we chose that. Also in this second graph here, we have our band gap energies. We can see copper indium diselenide way up here about the 22% efficiency range. On this same arc, we can see that copper indium sulfate is a little bit better, and current research is now switching from copper indium diselenide to the copper indium sulfide, but that is research that Dr. Friedfeld and Matthew Oliver have been working on. One more thing I wanted to point out here is we can see on this bit of a higher curve the silicon, which is what a lot of the commercial cells are, and the gallium arsenide, which is what they use on the space satellites and whatnot. When they send those up with solar panels, they're typically gallium arsenide since the 1990s. The reason for this is because they are very clearly efficient, but they are also very expensive to make, so it's not something that the average Joe could be able to just go and buy. So these are the steps we took to make our solar cell. First, we textured the silicon so that we could try and increase the efficiency of our cell. Then we adhered the gallium to the surface. Next, electrochemically deposit the copper indium diselenide as a thin film on top of the gallium. Then we would anneal the film to our substrate and then finally test and see if we have a solar cell. So a lot of my research is working with things that are very small and we can't actually see if we've made a difference, like did we actually texture the surface of the silicon. So we image these samples using a JSM 1600 scanning electron microscope, often called an SEM. This is the one that is in Dr. Friedfeld's lab, and a lot of my research was just imaging the different samples in between steps so that we could see what it looks like. So I'm going to just walk you through how to use this. First, we prep our sample. We have a film that has grown on top of some substrate. There's a little circle here. That's because there was a little air bubble when the film was growing. That's what that's from. And we use carbon tape and put it on top of this little stage mechanism that has a hole with threads on the inside. So we screw this stage mechanism onto this long pole. The pole has a disc on it to seal into this vacuum chamber, where we press this red button and wait for it to get down to the right pressure, which is almost vacuum-like. Then when the red light turns on, we know that it's ready to go. We pull this knob out, which opens a door inside of here, and then we very slowly and carefully let the pole go in until our sample reaches the stage that's inside of this whole machine. I say slowly and carefully because if you move the arm, the pole at all, you can ruin the vacuum for the entire machine, which has happened a couple times, and you learn very quickly because it takes a very long time to reset the vacuum. And this is the control console. You can see a little screen here. That's where we can observe what our sample looks like, and we can use this joystick and these knobs to move around and see different areas of our sample and also determine how zoomed in we are. The problem with zooming in too closely is the image starts to get fuzzy or snowy, and we have to determine what quality we're willing to risk in order to see really far into our sample. One last thing I'll mention about here is if you look in the bottom right, there is this black mechanism that's actually where they would put film, like real old Polaroid type film, and take pictures once they have everything set up on the screen. Nowadays we just put it onto a computer and it's all digital, but I just thought it was a really cool relic from another time. So our first objective for this cell was to texture the silicon. So we created a bath that was alcohol, water, and potassium hydroxide, heated it to 80 degrees Celsius, and just suspended our sample inside of it for about 30 minutes. Before the sample went in, it had a very flat, almost spongy looking texture with lots of plateaus, and afterwards we can see these beautiful pyramidal structures, which in theory the light goes in, hits off one of the sides, gets reflected onto another pyramidal structure, and might bounce around a couple times before leaving the cell, which increases the efficiency. Our next objective was to put the gallium on top of our silicon. Gallium has a very low melting point. It's around 27 degrees Celsius. You can just melt it in your hand. It might sting your hand a little bit, but it's relatively harmless. And you can see here that it has made a very even film on top of our substrate. You can see the gallium is coated evenly. We just warmed it up a little bit and then painted it on with a paintbrush. The problem with this is that the gallium, because it was so warm and easy to put on, it smoothed itself out and ruined the nice texturing process that we did in the step before, which we didn't think about ahead of time, but it's all right. We still just wanted to be able to get the gallium onto the silicon and see if we could grow a film on top of gallium. One thing I will say is we could have used an electron beam evaporator to evaporate the gallium on. It might have been a more efficient method instead of just painting it on, but this is very expensive, not very accessible, and we wanted cost-effective options, so painting it on worked just fine. So the third objective was to grow our film. We have our device over here, which will electrochemically deposit our solution. Our solution is made of copper chloride, indium chloride, selenium oxide, and sodium citrate. And the film tends to grow in a more acidic environment. So we did adjust it to a pH of 3.06 using diluted hydrochloric acid. And after all of this, we did see a beautiful film form on top of our gallium, which was great. We weren't sure if the film was going to actually form on top of the gallium or not. So good news that we can actually see this beautiful film. Next, we took it up to the geology lab and used their Brooker D8 Advanced XRD, which is the X-ray diffraction analysis machine. We did try it on a couple different substrates, not just the silicon. We also used sheets of graphene that were layered on top of each other that were almost like graphite and molybdenum. And we are looking for this peak right here at a tube theta of about 26 degrees. We can see a very small peak, which is fine. It's not that intense, but it's there. And that is our 112 peak for our film. Now, these other peaks here are from the silicon substrate itself. There's a lot of silicon there and not as much film in comparison, so you can see that the silicon is a bit more intense. Next, I have the graphene, which it looks like a very promising result when you see that the peak we're looking for is so intense, but really the way our graphene was, it sort of mimicked graphite, and graphite has a natural spike there at about 26 degrees, so it's kind of a false positive, though I'm sure a little bit of that is from the film. And lastly, the molybdenum, which we do see at about 26 degrees, the nice peak that we should have seen. So that was good. Our film was on all of them. Next up was to anneal the film. Now, we used the silicon because that's what our research was over, and we were really hoping that the gallium would diffuse into the film while it was annealing. Annealing is basically just baking your sample, but we don't want any oxygen or anything else that's in the air to react, so we filled our tube chamber with argon and then heated it to 400 degrees Celsius for about 30 minutes, which we did get this information from a prior SFA master's thesis in 2005. We annealed our sample together and then tested it to see if we had a solar cell, and look at that, we have diode behavior. So if we look down at the bottom here on the current side, we can see that our dark curve, which is this maroon color right here, has a short circuit current that is a little bit higher, it's vertically shifted above our light curve. So when we tested this without any light hitting it, it had one short circuit current, and when the light was on our cell, it absorbed a different amount, so it had a different short circuit current. So yay, we did in fact make a solar cell. That was great news. I know in the latest research they have switched to a different type of silicon wafer that they're using. They're now painting the gallium instead of on top. They're painting the gallium on the bottom, and it works just as well. We didn't get quite the SIGS cell that we were hoping for, but the CIS worked just fine. Are there any questions?
If you have any questions, feel free to turn your mic on and ask directly.
Hey, I'm curious about how long did it take to make the cell? Like from the very, like if you just started right now and you wanted to make one of these cells, how long would it take until you had it ready to test that voltage versus current?
Alright, so Dr. Adams was asking how long it takes to make the cell. If we were to start it right now, how long would we have to wait in order to test it? My personal research, we made the one cell over the entire semester, but it doesn't take that long. We were just working once a week, we would do the next step. I don't actually know how long it does take, but I would imagine less than a week.
Nice.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Back on your graph where you have the band the electron volts and the efficiency, and you talked about one that they used on in space.
Yes, the gallium arsenide.
Is one of the reasons that they don't use that here because it's dangerous to the environment? The gallium arsenide?
I don't know. This one right here.
Yeah, those are difficult to electrodeposit, so we're kind of limiting our application method. But there are other methods to make the gallium arsenide. Which if we could electrodeposit that successfully, we would try to do that. The gallium is an electrodeposit. It's a little tricky, but the real problem with the gallium arsenide is the arsenide part, the arsenide.
Okay.
And I'm curious, when you had the first silicon part of this and you put it in the SEM, what were you looking for exactly in the, like, are we just looking at it to see that it was uniform or smooth or?
Yeah, so Dr. Adams was asking what exactly we were looking for when we first put the silicon into the SEM, just without anything else. Let me get to the picture. What we were looking for is just to see, since the first step was to texture it, we initially put it in there to see what the texture was originally, and then wanted to see how it differed. Unfortunately, the files that I had for the before picture got corrupted, so I couldn't put them in my presentation, but I do have the after pictures, and I was like, oh, that's good enough.
How did it change?
Originally it was a very smooth, there were lots of plateaus and it looked almost spongy in nature. I don't know how to describe the sponginess of it. But afterwards we can see all of these pyramids that formed. Instead of all that beautiful texturing, it was just really flat.